Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining FEMA Region 2's webinar, The Flu, What to Do. A few technical considerations to capture before we begin. The audio should be playing through your computer speakers, so please do ensure that your volume is turned up so you can adequately hear the proceedings. This webinar is being recorded and will be provided for reference after the event concludes. With that, I'd like to introduce Mr. David Fortino, Continuity Manager with FEMA Region 2's National Preparedness Division. Mr. Fortino, please introduce our guest speaker today.
Yes, thank you. FEMA Region 2 has the responsibility to prepare and protect the participants in Region 2, which cover New York, New Jersey, New York City, U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Today I'm delighted to recognize a special guest who will be talking about the influenza pandemic threat that it covers our region, Dr. Stephen Morse. Dr. Stephen Morse is a professor of epidemiology at Columbia University School of Public Health and chair of Columbia University's Institutional Biosafety Committee. He was the founding director of the University Center for Public Health Preparedness from 2000 to 2005. He also currently serves as the Federal National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity and on the WHO, which is the expert group on pandemic influenza preparedness planning in the Eastern Mediterranean region. Dr. Morse has an extensive bio, but I'm going to skip right down to the bottom. He also has a PhD in microbiology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. With that, Dr. Morse, thank you very much for agreeing to be on our webinar, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to join you. The nice thing about a webinar is you don't have to venture out in the weather on what is here predicted to be not very pleasant at all. And the thing about infectious diseases, my field, is that there's always something going on in the field of infectious diseases. We always think we can kind of close the book on it, and then they come up and surprise us. So I'm also interested in infectious diseases like what I call emerging infectious diseases, Ebola, for example, HIV before the 80s, the infections we didn't know about until they suddenly come and surprise us. But the interesting thing about influenza is that although it's familiar to all of us and has been familiar to humankind for probably centuries, if not millennia, we still argue about how long ago we first got the flu. We all know it, we've all had it, or most of us anyway, and recognize it, but it still surprises us. Every year we really are unable to predict it, so I think it makes it particularly fascinating and, of course, particularly vexing for all of us in infectious diseases. May I have the next slide, please? So I'll talk about the flu. I'll also make a few comments about another outbreak going on in some parts of the country, including our region, which is measles. And although it's quite different scientifically, the reasons for that outbreak are quite similar in that really I'm going to emphasize the importance of immunization. Even if it's not perfect with the flu, it's much better with measles. It is one of our main tools. So when I first was asked to give this talk, it was supposed to originally be in January, and then something happened. I think there was a government shutdown, and we weren't allowed to show slides. I thought that it would now be too late to talk about the flu, but it's still flu season. So it's not just flu season again, but flu season still. May I have the next slide, please? And this is what it looked like just between Christmas and New Year's, just after the basically at the end of 2018. The colors are pretty much self-explanatory, but you can see New Jersey, New York City were in red, which implied very high level of flu activity. And I thought that the peak was certainly coming soon. Usually comes around February. May I have the next slide, please? And it hasn't been overtaken by events. Unfortunately, the flu is very much with us, and if anything, it has actually intensified a bit. As you can see, there are now more areas in red, and the flu continues to make its march. We are still debating, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, whether the flu, in fact, is peaked for the season. Many of us think that, in fact, it hasn't reached its peak yet, and may be doing some things that are going to surprise us still. May I have the next slide, please? So the flu, although we all think about it as something that, we deal with almost every year and is often a nuisance, can also be a serious problem, particularly for the elderly and the very young who have not yet gotten much exposure and therefore don't have any immune protection against strains of the flu. This shows the hospitalization rates for this year by age with the current seasonal flu we have. And the green line, which reaches above the others and you can see has not flattened out yet, is in fact in the senior citizens, a category, by the way, in which I now fall, 65 and over, and places like nursing homes and other places where you have senior centers, where you have a lot of susceptible people, are often a place where you really see a lot of influenza activity. The next line below that in light blue is the very young, the 0 to 4-year-old group, and those again are also highly susceptible because of their limited exposure to the flu. And then the rest of us fall somewhere in between. These are hospitalizations, so really these are the patients, the people who have been more severely affected with the flu, enough that they needed to go and get medical attention. Most of us, of course, don't do that, and I'm going to recommend, in fact, that what we normally do, which is to basically stay home, is probably the very best thing we can do. May I have the next slide, please? So this is the last few seasons selected, and I really have to thank the CDC, the Centers, our federal public health agency, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which has become increasingly informative and increasingly up to date about the flu and is an excellent source of information. In New York City, of course, the New York City Health Department as well. So I think in Region 2, we're very lucky to have very active agencies, including FEMA and the local health departments, that really are very good at trying to stay on top of this evolving situation, because the flu is rapidly evolving each year. What we see on this slide are a number of different, and it's kind of very colorful, a number of different seasons of influenza, so-called seasonal influenza, and I'll come back to what we mean by that in a few minutes. But seasonal influenza over the last 10 years, or not quite 10 years or so. And you can see that they've all differed somewhat. Some of that depends on which particular variety of influenza it is. I'll explain that in more detail in a moment. But also depends on a number of other factors, the climate, people's habits, time of year, and a lot of things we haven't learned to predict yet very well. The dark red curve with the triangles is the current influenza season. This is the most recent slide I've been able to find, the data as of February 9th, I think it was. So it's still a couple of weeks ago, but you can see that we had a small peak. I showed you that in the first map as an indication of what that looked like, and it's now started to go up again, and we don't know yet if it's going to start flattening out, or as we can see has happened in several of the past seasonal flu epidemics, or whether it's going to continue going upward for a while. And I'll talk a little bit later at the end of this talk about ways to try to predict this, which is still an evolving art, and more art than science at this point. May I have the next slide, please? Okay. For many years, data has been collected by the National Center for Health Statistics, now a branch of CDC, looking at what we call pneumonia and influenza mortality in major cities. And this is done by looking at death certificates and vital records and trying to look at cause of death. In fact, I had a PhD student some years ago who looked at trends since the 1918 pandemic, a very serious event that I'll talk about in a few minutes. It's very hard not to talk about it when you talk about the flu. And anyway, we just had kind of a 100th anniversary, if you will, of that world-shaking event. And this data has actually been collected for that long that you can make comparisons. This is not the flu. It includes pneumonia and other deaths, but it's an indication, at least, of mortality from diseases like the flu. And you can see that this differs from year to year. Some years, 2014, was definitely above average and a serious one. The large peak on the right was last season. That was one of the worst seasonal flu outbreaks we've had in terms of both mortality and the severity of infections in probably the last decade or more, as you can see in comparison with 2014. And we're still worried, obviously, about, what we could have done better there. And I'll talk about that also. May I have the next slide, please? So mortality, as you see from this from those previous curves, we can estimate from a number of different sources what a proportion of mortality, of deaths each year might be due to influenza. It's an estimate at best, and it varies not only with the severity of the influenza season, but also with our ability to pick up this information and analyze it. And so, as you can see earlier on, there were estimates of by CDC of 19,000 influenza-associated deaths per season. That was in the 90s. That estimate was increased to about 36,000. And that is probably not because the flu has changed so much, although we have improved the fitness of the ability of our vaccines to match the circulating flu strains. So the vaccines are better most years than they were in the 70s, for example. But that number is not is largely because, not because the flu has gotten worse, but probably because our methods of estimating have gotten better. So, these numbers vary, but they're roughly in that ballpark. That roughly compares with the number of traffic fatalities, automobile fatalities each year. In 2017, that was a particularly bad season, and that, it's estimated, led to close to 80,000 deaths in the U.S. attributed to that flu season alone. We hope that has been unusual, and we hope that it remains unusual. Globally, we have obviously more difficulty making these estimates, but we estimate we estimate that somewhere between about roughly 500,000 respiratory deaths occur each year, many of them due to influenza, although not all of them. May I have the next slide, please? So this is not trivial, although it's trivial to many of us, because many of us get the flu. Even a relatively low rate of severe disease or mortality, death due to the flu can cause very large numbers. We'll come back to that when we talk about this tremendous event we call the 1918 flu. So this year, CDC is estimating that for this season, as of a couple of weeks ago, the most recent for which they have data, there were probably about 15 or so million, that's a conservative estimate, people infected with the flu. And most of us were probably aware of it if we got it. I was lucky this year, but I also got my flu shot, which may or may not have helped. But I didn't get the flu, at least so far. There were over 7 million, close to 8 million medical visits due to the flu. These were people who felt sick enough to see their healthcare provider, or of course children. Very often, obviously, if your kids have the flu, you're going to take them to see the pediatrician. In terms of hospitalizations, we had somewhere around 200,000, and these are usually lab confirmed, so we can usually consider those figures pretty reliable. In terms of deaths, those are estimates, but so far we've probably had between 12 and 20,000 flu deaths. Again, mostly in the very old, the elderly, not all very old, and the very young, but all ages at lower levels. May I have the next slide, please? So it's shaping up to be a much milder flu year than last year, which was terrible, but by no means one that we can ignore. When we do have flu outbreaks, we really can't ignore it. Let me back up, since I'm a virologist, I can't resist saying a few words about the flu itself. And many of my colleagues, when I first talked about emerging viruses and emerging infections, infections like SARS when it first appeared in 2003, severe acute respiratory syndrome, Middle East respiratory syndrome, a related disease in the Middle East, as the name indicates. Some people get it from contact with camels, and Ebola when it was first recognized in 1976. They're not known to us. They suddenly appear. They seem to be surprises, and I call those emerging infections. Some years ago, often they come from other species. And some of my colleagues have said that it's cheating to call influenza an emerging infection because, after all, it's been around so long. But the reality is influenza is the one infection I know of, certainly the one viral infection, that actually does everything. It has a lot of variation and mutation, genetic changes of a variety of different types that make it highly unpredictable, and has a very wide host range. That is to say, when it's not infecting us, different influenza viruses are capable of infecting many other species, and so there are a lot of opportunities for influenza to make new variations in nature, and some of them may eventually get to us. So it's really a fascinating virus, although if you're in bed with influenza or out of work, or all your colleagues are out of work, you may not in fact appreciate. It's better appreciated at a distance, how interesting a virus it is. But, the fact that we're talking about it now after hundreds of years of experience with it, I think is a pretty good indication that it still baffles us in many ways. So there are a lot of different influenza viruses infecting a wide variety of birds and mammals. And in fact, it just coincidentally happens while I was getting my PhD at Wisconsin, I can't resist mentioning, we didn't know where influenza actually stays when it's not busy infecting us or other species. And in fact, it's natural hosts, the place where influenza normally resides, if you will, and where you can find the greatest variety of influenza viruses in nature, is migratory waterfowl like ducks and geese and such. And that was only appreciated in 1977. So that's where influenza is hanging out, and there are many different influenza viruses in that population, which of course are moving and mixing and coming in contact with other species, which is why influenza does so many different things. There are four major types, as we call them, of influenza: A, B, C, and D, logically enough. D was recently identified and is still pretty unusual. We haven't found very many examples. There are some in swine and cattle and a few others. When most of us talk about the flu, we're thinking about type A, which is the one that's most prevalent and also the most variable. It's the only one so far that we have seen associated with what we call pandemics, and therefore it's the greatest concern. Type B also is very widespread and common. It shows a much lesser degree of variation, but it's still a problem, especially in children who are less frequently. They're young, they may not have been exposed to type B, and so they're much more likely to have serious infections with type B. Almost nobody talks about type C because it doesn't show much variation, and it just causes the flu. If you've had it once, basically, you don't have to think about it again. So most of what I'm going to say refers to type A and a little bit type B. Those are the ones we worry about the most. May I have the next slide, please? So this is influenza virus from Legoland, if you will, but it just sort of gives you a three-dimensional picture of what it looks like conceptually. As you can see, it's got some stuff on the inside, which is the genome of the virus, the nucleic acid, the basic directions for carrying out viral functions and making more viruses. As you know, all viruses basically hijack our cellular machinery to make more copies of themselves and then get on with the job of infecting other cells. The influenza virus genome is actually in 8 pieces or segments of RNA. Viruses are the only known life forms that in some of them, not all of them, but some viruses, many of them, do not use DNA as their genetic material, but use RNA. That's different. There are other viruses, pox virus, for example. Smallpox, we hope, is now officially eradicated and we hope now extinct outside of a few places where samples are being kept and studied for research. But many of the viruses we're concerned about, like influenza, pox viruses, herpes viruses, use DNA, just like we do, and they can obviously carry more information. RNA viruses are more numerous and also susceptible to more, or subject to more, variation and mutation, which is what makes them interesting. But these are the only known life forms, these viruses that have RNA genomes, that use RNA as their genetic material instead of DNA. So having said that, you can also see that there are a number of surface proteins on the front of the virus, on the outside of the virus. These are called the hemagglutinin, shown in blue here. Hemagglutinin is the receptor. It's the protein that binds to the cellular receptor that allows the virus to attach to our cells, those that it can attach to, and get into the cell. There's another protein called the neuraminidase, which allows it to detach afterwards. Otherwise, it would get all clumped up. And in fact, many of the antiviral agents for influenza that we use today are called neuraminidase inhibitors because they block the action of what my colleague Rob Webster used to call molecular scissors, the neuraminidase that allows the virus to cut itself free of the cell receptors that are inside, that the hemagglutinin binds to, and that are inside and outside the target cells. May I have the next slide, please? This is a cartoon showing the same thing, but it comes from an old colleague, Joshua Lederberg, so I can't resist showing it. But it shows, again, in sort of a diagrammatic form, the hemagglutinin, an important surface protein, which is very important in our immune response and also in vaccine manufacturing, and the neuraminidase, which represent the two major surface proteins of the virus. There's another one that's I won't talk about. Inside you see the 8 different segments of the viral genome. These are RNA, and they comes in pieces. Think of these as like tiny little chromosomes, viral-sized chromosomes. But this enables the virus to do a number of other genetic tricks in addition to the mutation, for which all RNA viruses are well known. May I have the next slide, please? So I've introduced the terminology. Here's what the virus actually looks like under the electron microscope. You can see the fringe on the outside. These are the hemagglutinin, HA, or for short we'll call them H proteins, and the neuraminidase, NA or N proteins. Inside you have the other components I showed you. Peter Medawar, a Nobel laureate for his work in immunology some years ago from Australia, both Dr. Lederberg and Dr. Medawar sadly are no longer with us, referred to a virus as a piece of bad news wrapped in a protein coat. So here's the bad news. You can see the genetic material of the virus and the packaging around it that I showed you in those earlier diagrams. And here's the protein and other materials to help stabilize and package the virus, and then these surface proteins, that's what our immune system mostly sees, what our bodies mostly see, and what the virus uses to get in and out of the cell. And that, in shorthand, is what we refer to when we talk about different subtypes or varieties of these viruses, like type A specifically. H1 means hemagglutinin type 1, N1 neuraminidase type 1, and that's the shorthand that also tells us about both the 1918 and its distant relative, the 2009 pandemic viruses. That's the one, by the way, that's circulating right now, the progeny of 2009. May I have the next slide, please? The virus gets out of the cell by pushing through the cell membrane, doesn't do the cell much good, and so it's covered by essentially modified cell membrane into which those protein protein, surface proteins that I showed you are inserted and sticking out. May I have the next slide, please? So these are classic pictures, and in fact, the question is, what makes influenza? We know it's one of the most variable viruses, maybe not as much in some of its natural hosts, but certainly in the human population as it circulates around and as we see new pandemics happen. And in fact, these occur by two completely different genetic mechanisms. So what we think happens with new influenza strains, the so-called seasonal or annual, those are not quite accurate terms because it's not completely seasonal and it's not completely, it's not every year, but every couple of years in irregular periods that usually occur about the same time of the year during the winter for temperate climates. What causes that is a lot of mutation that is going on as a result of the virus copying itself, and during the copying process, errors occur. That's what happens with copying of RNA. The virus actually has its own copying mechanism that uses cellular machinery to do it, but it has its own special enzyme protein that does the actual copying, and it's error prone. It causes a lot of mutations to occur. Some of those may be successful, may result in a variation in a different hemagglutinin surface protein that makes that particular virus look a little different from one we've had before, and as a result of that mutation, our immune system doesn't recognize it right away, and so it's able to reinfect. That's what we see with these seasonal epidemics as we're having now, or as we had last season. And every known human seasonal influenza also happens to be the progeny of a previous pandemic. So right now, what we have circulating is the progeny of the 2009 pandemic virus. It's obviously many generations different, so it's got some mutations in that hemagglutinin surface protein that allows it to fool our immune systems. If you will, old wine from 2009 in new bottles with a new label that kind of fools us for a while. But obviously, eventually our immune systems kick in and succeed. The purpose of immunization is to try, obviously, to anticipate that and get our immune systems engaged before the actual virus starts circulating. The other interesting thing is that influenza in humans, actually like a bucket brigade, has to circulate around from person to person to person in a worldwide chain of transmission. So if you can break that chain anywhere long enough, you could actually prevent it. But we've never succeeded in doing that, which is an indication of how hard it is and how successful influenza has been in escaping our various defense mechanisms and attempts to control it. Now, pandemics don't arise, and I'll explain a pandemic in a moment, by that mechanism of continuing mutations that make the virus slightly different. Instead, you get a mixing of gene segments. You remember I showed you those 8 different gene segments. 2 different influenza viruses, influenza A viruses, may differ in a number of different ways, and when 2 of them infect the same host, the same individual, or the same cells at the same time, they can mix and match in a variety of different ways. There are some things that prevent every combination from happening, but there are a number of different combinations, and many of them probably are not successful, but every so often one of them really hits the jackpot, gives a new combination of genes, especially usually a novel hemagglutinin gene, again that H, but often others as well, that now is completely different from something we've seen before, sufficiently different, although it may have many similarities, that nobody has basically, who in recent years has any immunity to it, has seen it before and made an immune response, and so it's now able to infect much more easily because it's so different from the previous influenzas that have been circulating. And we think that's how pandemics occur. May I have the next slide, please? So a pandemic is simply, it's from the Greek word meaning all, and it's simply a large epidemic. An epidemic is an occurrence of a disease above normal expectations, and in some area, whatever we normally expect. And so any outbreak of influenza basically is an epidemic. I showed you in a much earlier slide sort of the baselines of influenza and pneumonia deaths. You may remember sort of those rolling curves underneath those red peaks. So those red peaks are above the normal threshold. Those would qualify as epidemics. An epidemic that is geographically widespread, or so large it essentially involves the entire world, in terms of the World Health Organization, WHO, essentially two regions of WHO, which are two different parts of the world, would be considered a pandemic. Doesn't say anything about severity, just how far it's able to travel, because it is novel. Type A is the only influenza type we know so far that's been able to cause pandemics. And all you need, really all it needs, is a novel influenza subtype that's unfamiliar to most of us who are alive today, and that usually arises by mixing and matching, this assortment of genes that I mentioned, of gene segments, and then it needs to spread from person to person sufficiently. What I mean sufficiently is about as well as your ordinary garden variety seasonal influenza, or maybe not even quite that well initially. But because it's so unfamiliar to us, it's able to infect very easily, even if it can't spread well. If it can spread about as well as an ordinary influenza, then it can go around the world as we take it and travel with it. May I have the next slide, please? So we've had several pandemics in history. 1918, the so-called Spanish flu, is probably the greatest disaster, actually, in all of recorded history. We estimate that there have been over 50 million deaths, probably closer to 100 million. It occurred during World War I, which may have also helped to propel it forward and infect more people. And so we talk about World War I a lot more because it tends to overshadow the major effects of the Spanish flu. But it probably, the H1N1 of 1918, the so-called Great Influenza, but that one probably killed more people than that war, and probably many other wars combined. The next pandemic, so the 1918 flu held sway for about, and its progeny held sway until 1957, when it was replaced by the next pandemic of what was called the Asian flu. That, in shorthand, was a different hemagglutinin and a different neuraminidase type, H2N2. Now, these shorthands are a convenient way of referring to it. They're not every H1 is identical, so the H1 of the 2009 is somewhat different from the 1918 hemagglutinin 1, but it basically is in the same category or subtype, and that's how we refer to it in shorthand. But these are numbered more or less historically. That's why they seem to be sequential. So the 1957 flu, I had the flu that year, and I remember it. I was obviously young then. I also had measles that year, so it wasn't a very good year for me. I got to stay out of school a lot. Maybe it was. I don't know. But the H2N2, or Asian flu, was a major flu pandemic. It did not cause nearly as many deaths, and probably not quite as many infections as the Great Flu of 1918, but it was certainly infected much of the world, and many people who are old enough, like me, will remember having had it. And it caused basically the flu, although it caused deaths in people who were the elderly and the young again. And then it was replaced, in turn, in 1968. So the progeny of 1957, H2N2, circulated around the world as the seasonal flu with various mutations that it accumulated during its circulation, allowing it to reinfect people in the form of the so-called seasonal flu until it was replaced again by the next pandemic of 1968, the so-called Hong Kong flu, H3N2. That was somewhat milder, and in fact, 57 was probably what most of us would consider a middle-of-the-road pandemic. None of them are typical. They all differ, but, if you want an example, that's probably what we usually plan for. 68 was considered milder, but ironically that H3N2, you're going to see this term again and again. Last year's seasonal flu was a long, distant progeny of that 1968 pandemic. It was an H3N2 that had accumulated many mutations in the meantime, many variations, but it's an H3N2, and that's one of the nastier seasonal flus we have, and in fact probably has caused more deaths since 1968 than the pandemic itself. So we have to be careful when we talk about pandemics, because some of them may seem very mild, but sometimes you have to wait to see what they're going to do. 2009 seemed like a very mild pandemic, much milder than any we've had, although it did cause deaths. That was our last pandemic, H1N1, and this year the progeny of that pandemic, the H1N1, 2009, are again with mutations circulating as the predominant flu. In recent years, they've kind of switched off between H3N2 and H1N1, and usually H3N2 has been worse when it's come around as the seasonal flu. But it takes a few years usually for a flu strain that's circulating, like H3N2 or H1N1, to accumulate mutations that successfully escapes our immune system and transmits well in the population. So that's why it happens sporadically, not every single year. And that's why they often take turns, but it's not a pattern we can depend on. It varies so much. May I have the next slide, please? So I mentioned how pandemics occur by what we called antigenic shift, or the reassortment of gene segments to give rather novel combinations, different from just ordinary mutations that give rise to the, or drift as we used to call them, that give rise to the ordinary, but sometimes obviously very deadly seasonal flus we see. And it's interesting that these actually all come originally from waterfowl, which have all the different kinds of influenzas in nature, many of them not yet adapted for humans, so they don't infect us. But pigs are thought to be mixing vessels. So many places in the world put pigs and waterfowl together. China has an agricultural system that does this very effectively, and it may well be that the opportunity for a new influenza virus to get into to pigs, which are somewhat more permissive than humans to many novel influenzas, may provide the opportunity for the virus to evolve into a virus that can now infect humans. There's some evidence to this, although there's no smoking gun, but there is, I think, good. It's a reasonable story. Let's say it's just a good story, but that's our current theory. May I have the next slide, please? So 1918 was the worst with all of those infections. And may I have the next slide, please? In fact, we can go through the next few very quickly. So there were a lot of deaths, and stop here, please. There were a lot of deaths, especially among young, healthy individuals in places like army camps. One of the earlier slides shows an army camp where there were a lot of people sick and many deaths. It was proportionately very small, just a few percent, but when you have half the world literally infected, half the world's population, that's enough to cause a lot of fatalities. And what made this very unusual is shown in this slide. Normal influenza has that U-shape, sometimes people call it a bathtub curve. That's true of many of the seasonal flus as well. The young who have developing immune systems but are still, obviously their immune system still developing and still gaining experience with the virus and, as well as other things, are among the most susceptible, and therefore, we worry about mortality in that group. And then the young, healthy individuals from older children on to middle age generally just get the flu, and fatalities tend to be, as you can see, quite low normally. This is true of the seasonal flus as well. And then it goes up in the elderly, those around 65 and older. What made the 1918 so noteworthy was that W-shaped curve, that curve, that increase in mortality in the middle that actually was in young, healthy adults, like those army recruits, and that made it exceptional. We're still arguing about why. We think it may have been the way that the host overreacted, the way that infected people, healthy infected people, overreacted to the virus, just as they do in the case of Ebola and sepsis, which some of you may be familiar with. But we don't really know. So we're still discussing that. May I have the next slide, please? The pandemic was so severe that, in fact, it caused mortality from infectious diseases had been dropping during that whole period, and this caused a spike in infectious disease mortality around 1918. May I have the next slide, please? Luckily, that trend in declining mortality has continued, but we still worry about it. This shows a projection made some years ago when there was pandemic planning to try to figure out, in case there was another pandemic. There always will be. We just don't know when. We don't know how severe. We don't know what flu virus is going to cause it, but it has to be something, we may already know about that's out there but not yet in humans, or maybe something that has been in the past long ago, or it may be something we haven't spotted yet that's about to evolve. So people worried about the bird flu, for example, H5N1, starting in 2003, which we worried about a lot, but most of us thought that wasn't going to be the next pandemic. On the other hand, we knew another pandemic would be coming. We just didn't know what it would be. And at that time, the CDC tried to project, given the death rates, the mortality rates of past pandemics, what would it look like today? What would the number of deaths look like today? And you can see 1918 was completely off the charts, but the case fatality ratio, the proportion of people who got sick, the proportion who died of those who got sick, was actually fairly low, with in the low single digits. And yet, if it happened today, it would cause almost 2 million deaths in the U.S. alone. 57 and 68 and severe seasonal influenza, like last season, are much lower case fatality rates. That is to say, most people get it and survive. A few, unfortunately, die. And you can see that this causes somewhere, last season it caused almost 90,000 projected deaths, closer to 75 to 80,000. So that projection probably wasn't so bad. May I have the next slide, please?
Dr. Morse, just to
Yes.
interrupt for one moment, we have about 12 minutes of time left in our scheduled event. However, we are happy to continue recording the session here. So for those participants that want to stay on, we will continue to move forward. Please feel free to do so. For those participants who need to drop off at around 1 p.m., no worries. We will be recording this session, so it will be distributed to the participant list so you can catch up later. Just wanted to interrupt and let you know, Dr. Morse, take your time. We'll get through everything.
Okay, well, I'm going to go through the next few things very quickly. Just to remind you that our last pandemic of 2009, most of these have started in Southeast Asia, but our last pandemic of 2009 actually started probably on a pig farm, from a pig farm in Mexico, and then spread very rapidly to the U.S. from some students who may have spent spring break in Mexico and come back to New York City, but it could have started anywhere. There were early cases in California. Well, we're all worried about pandemics, so in fact, over the years, influenza pandemic preparedness plans have been developed, and there was a particular push after the bird flu, H5N1, in 2005, simply because it was recognized that even if it wasn't the next pandemic, it was a very lethal flu for those who caught it. It didn't spread very well, but it was clear that we needed to really have up-to-date pandemic plans. And that included improved surveillance, early warning, and finding out what's out there, better vaccine capacity, and stockpiling things to protect and prevent influenza, as well as obviously working with state and local agencies, including FEMA very much so, on improved plans. May I have the next slide, please? And so there have been several plans for this. It was, next slide, please. Updated most recently in the last couple of years, and basically they give you a very good idea of how to do continuity of business planning, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few minutes. May I have the next slide, and we'll go through these very, very quickly. So 2009, I'll remind you, nobody was really expecting what the next pandemic would be like. May I have the next slide, please? And we think it started in Mexico. Next slide. Very probably someone who came in contact with an infected pig that they don't sneeze, they actually cough very loudly. Maybe they do sneeze. You can hear them a mile away when they get a bad respiratory infection. And this young man, unfortunately, very angelic young man, may have been the first victim. He luckily recovered, but of course the flu spreads to other people who are in contact. Next slide, please. Next. And New York was one of the other places where it went. Next. Where many people, we don't know how many people actually got sick, but it seems like there was a lot of flu-like illness at this period when normally you wouldn't expect to find it. So a phone survey showed that probably over at least 10%, maybe more like a quarter of people in New York actually had flu-like illness, which may very well have been the flu. Next one, please. Next. Yes, and as any pandemic, it spread around the world. And in fact, I was in Beijing at the time, shortly afterwards, where they were checking people's temperatures when you went into the hotel. Next slide, please. Okay, so seasonal flu is a different beast. It may be the result of these pandemics, but it keeps coming around again and again. Next, please. Yeah, and this is the current status as of this season. Next, please. Yeah, and most of it has been the progeny, as you can see from the gold bars there. When it's tested in the laboratory, there's a laboratory network for testing this, most of the flu so far has been H1N1, the descendants of the 2009 pandemic. So we call it H1N1 PDM09. Originally called the swine flu, but that's an inaccurate term, so we now call it pandemic 2009. This has mutated over the years, so it's different now when it comes back each time as a seasonal form. It's somewhat different from the original pandemic, and that allows it to reinfect. And usually H1N1s have been much milder when they come back as seasonal flus, even though the H1N1 of 1918 was one of the worst disasters in history. Its progeny over the years have been much milder, and that's been true in recent years too. So far it's been a relatively moderately heavy flu season is what the CDC would say. However, in other parts of the country, the somewhat nastier, more severe H3N2, the distant progeny of the 1968 pandemic, is still in the world. Both of them now, for the first time in history since the 70s, are actually coexisting somehow, which is kind of an interesting situation because we've never faced it before, making a complex situation even more complex. And in some parts of the U.S., the South in particular, we have seen H3N2, and it's now been increasing in some places and spreading. So we're not sure whether, in fact, the flu has peaked here, the seasonal flu has peaked here, as it seems to have, and is now on the downslope, or whether now H3N2 is going to start coming in and now making a kind of a second peak to a new flu season. And that's anyone's guess. But it's important to keep an eye on these things. May I have the next slide, please? So that just shows the current situation, as you can see, with the now mixture of seasonal flus in this country. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a lot of things we can do. One of the most important, of course, is early warning and then planning. And immunization is the mainstay of what we do. If you can get immunized in advance, then it's very important, because if the immunization, it will protect a lot of people, and we are doing a better and better job of actually identifying what's going to be most likely to come around and putting it in, growing it up and putting it into the vaccine so that we have a good match, as they say, with what's going to come around. This is also true of measles, which is much easier. It doesn't vary as much, but requires a very high level of immunization to be effective. And that's why we see outbreaks, because there are places where people are simply refusing or not getting a chance to get immunized with this immunization that has almost eliminated the measles in most of the world. We hope to see that with influenza, but it's been much more variable and hence much trickier. On the other hand, influenza doesn't spread terribly well, ironically, whereas measles is one of the most catching, most transmissible. So it's very important to have a very high level of protection. Non-pharmaceutical interventions are what we do in the meantime. May I have the next slide, please? Next slide. Yeah, so that includes, obviously, thank you very much, things we call social distancing. What that means is stay home if you're sick, if you possibly can. And many pandemic plans we've developed over the years call for things like, people who are non-essential. Everyone who's been through a government shutdown knows this, but it's a different thing. Should stay home if they're sick, or if someone in their family is sick, they probably need to take care of them anyway, and not spread it on to others. Because obviously someone comes in and works when they're sick, they could make many other people sick. It is a problem to plan for those who are essential workers. The people running transportation, HVAC systems, public safety, and essential functions in business. And really, we want to immunize those people in advance, vaccinate them, and healthcare workers to help prevent them from becoming infected if we possibly can, and becoming a source of infection to the others they come in contact with. But the main issue is if you think you have the flu, stay home if you can. Telecommute if you possibly can. And that's the mainstay, social distancing of most of our activities. Now the next slide, please. And it's spread, the flu is spread by the respiratory route. We still argue about how far it can spread, but most of the flu activity basically is within 6 feet or so of someone coughing and sneezing, but may also occur before they have symptoms. So, you know, we worry about that, and we don't want people, obviously, to come in contact with others they could infect if they themselves are coming down with it. They're usually too sick anyway, and it takes a lot of effort. Next slide, please. Next, this slide, which is animated, just shows that many people get flu from each other in the workplace, in schools, and of course in households. The same message, stay home if you possibly can. Next, please. Okay, and there are a number of measures that the CDC has recommended for doing just that, and this is available on their website. Next, please. So at times when there are shortages of vaccine, in fact, we have these recommendations, and they come to the fore, but they're good any time of the year because vaccines are not 100% effective even when we can get them. Next slide, please. So again, there are a lot of healthy habits. Don't sneeze or cough on others. Stay home when you're sick. Cover your coughs and sneezes. Wash your hands. We don't know whether that's really stops the flu, but it prevents a lot of other infections, and it's a very good habit to have. So cover your coughs and sneezes. Wash your hands. Stay home if you feel you have the flu. Next, please. If you feel really sick, get medical attention. We do have drugs that are effective. There is a second one that was just recently approved by the FDA for very severe infections if people are really sick or if they have some unusual situation, or in some cases if they're essential workers who need to be protected against the flu and may not feel sufficiently protected, but we need them to come to work. Next, and if you're very sick, obviously, we have intensive care, but we hope very few people will fall into that category, although obviously thousands do each year. May I have the next slide, please? Next. Vaccination is the most important. Right now, our vaccination is a little bit old-fashioned, but we're beginning to catch up, and we really need newer methods. But we've gotten much better at matching the strains that are circulating around, usually in the southern hemisphere, before they come here. And so we usually get, because they get their winter first, we usually get about a 6-month window when we see what's going on in the southern hemisphere and try to guess which of those strains circulating around will be most likely to come here. With flu A, we've generally done a pretty good job. B is a little trickier, although it doesn't vary quite as radically as flu A. It's harder, and generally there are more mixed types, different variants of flu B. So we usually try to hedge our bets there. There's now a 4 quadrivalent vaccine that has 2 flu B variants to hedge our bets. May I have the next, please? And effectiveness varies, but even last year when we thought it was terrible, actually, as you can see, it was still about 40%, and that's generally where it goes. May I have the next slide, please? Last year, the flu vaccine, for a variety of reasons, was not as effective against the predominant subtype, which was H3N2 last season, a mutant variant of H3N2, and that is often more severe and a little harder in some cases to make a good vaccine. But last year, the vaccine wasn't as good as we expected it to be. Nevertheless, should you take it? And the answer is yes. May I have the next slide, please? The reason is very simple. Flu is not the most catching infection, whereas measles is very catching, but it doesn't have to be 100% effective to work because of a concept we call herd immunity. May I have the next slide, please? Each individual shown here on the left, the red bar, the red circle, infected with influenza, it basically could infect on the average 2 other people who are susceptible to influenza, who could catch it. If we can prevent about half of the infections with influenza from being transmitted, from happening, we could in fact stop the epidemic. That's the bar we need to reach. If 100% of the people were immunized with a vaccine that's only 50% effective, we could essentially put the flu out of business, or this outbreak out of business in this country. And with measles, it's a similar situation. We do have herd immunity. The difference is that measles is so transmissible, one case can give rise to between 10 and 15 other additional cases, that we need a very high level of immunity. So you really need to immunize effectively. The reason we see outbreaks is because people are not getting immunized. In some countries like the Philippines, there's simply not enough, or they're not getting enough access to the immunization. In other places, here in parts of New York City and on the West Coast, people are refusing immunization for their children because they think it's bad. But believe me, the measles is much worse. There were 500,000 cases when I caught it as a child. Now, luckily, we're down to a few hundred to a few thousand in the U.S., but they're preventable, just as influenza is preventable if we have a good vaccine, we do with measles, and if we give it to enough people. May I have the next slide, please? So we haven't quite achieved that. We would like to achieve that, but the reality is that about half of the population nationally, and roughly about the same, we're doing a little better in Region 2, gets their vaccine. The rest of us, unfortunately, either forget or don't think we need it. There are a variety of different reasons. But even if the vaccine is only half effective, if everybody got it, we could really bring down the flu epidemic to almost immeasurably low levels. We're talking about future ways of producing better vaccines, more effective vaccines, vaccines with broader protection. Those are in the future, and I hope they'll be on the horizon, and they're on the horizon now in the next few years. But the reality is that we still don't have enough people getting this inexpensive and easily obtained vaccine. And if enough people got it, we could really cut down the effects. Even if the vaccine itself is not that effective, it's also generally very, very safe. We've given it to hundreds of millions with very minimal side effects. May I have the next slide, please? This is just to remind us, may I have the next slide, that there are a number of different choices, and some are better than others, and some of them, but basically, it's more important to have it than to wait for the perfect one to come along. So, It's not too late to get your flu shot now, because even this late in the season, there are still some people who haven't yet caught the flu, who may be exposed to it, and who knows if H3N2, which is also in this vaccine, which includes both an H1 and an H3 component, and a flu B, we don't know if that's going to be making a comeback as well. May I have the next slide, please? So this is the composition of this year's vaccine. They vary a little bit from year to year. Some years they don't change very much because basically the flu hasn't changed very much in what's circulating. It's just getting to new people who haven't been immunized or haven't been infected before. Next slide, please. So we need better flu vaccines, but we also need more people to take it. And we also are worried about the elderly in whom flu vaccines are not nearly as effective. There have been attempts to do this by making stronger flu vaccines, or you can take it twice in a season. This hasn't been officially studied, but a lot of physicians actually do this. And it may not be a bad idea, although we have no data. It seems to make sense. If you've had it already, it probably isn't a bad idea. If you haven't had it yet, it's a very good idea, not too late to get your flu shot. So having put in that ad, may I have the next slide, please? We're still trying to guess what the flu is going to do, or to predict what the flu is going to do, and it's been difficult. CDC has had an annual competition, kind of an annual flu bake-off for flu prediction. This is one of the better ones right now from one of my colleagues at Columbia, available on their website. You have the site there, but none of them are perfect, and you can't predict anything until it actually gets here. Then you can start to forecast what it might do, but it's obviously again, very difficult to do. This is one of the better ones, and it shows the peak should be around now, and we hope that's true. May I have the next slide, please? People are using other technologies now to try to do the same thing. Such as smart thermometers to try to monitor people's temperature. There's an app for that right now. And they think also the flu has peaked now. But it might be back, and we can't be the H3N2 might be coming back now to new areas. So we really can't say that the peak is over. So it's still timely to get your flu shot. And every year, I think we really still need to do that. A lot of people work very hard to make that happen. May I have the next slide, please? So here are some resources if you're interested in keeping up to date on influenza. FEMA, I'm sure, has excellent information as well on planning and continuity of business planning. Next slide. Just to remind us, the infectious disease world continues to be a busy place. Next slide. And for those of you who have questions or have had to drop off early, thank you very much for your time and attention. My email is down there at the bottom of this slide. And again, thank you, and I apologize for getting carried away with my subject, but I hope you all have a safe and healthy winter and no flu this year. And try to avoid it. Get your flu shots now while you still can, and stay well. Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Morse, in support of FEMA and FEMA Region 2, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, fantastic information on a very critical topic, and very timely. So we appreciate you participating.
You're very kind.
Participating. Absolutely, sir. Thank you to all of our participants for participating. We hope you found this webinar informational. As Dr. Morse said, should you have any follow-on questions, you can see on your screen his email address. Thank you again, and we look forward to hosting you for additional webinars.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for running over, but hopefully it will help people to avoid the flu this year or know what to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So long.